Men rising up to end the silence around us about the chains that bind us, to dispel the darkness of illusion with luminous spiritual technologies, to finally become the hero within us all. This is Arise, the Honest Man's podcast. As per usual, myself, Krunavatar Das, and my co-host Jai Jagannath Prabhu are present, and with us our dear Rasanath Prabhu, who was with us last week to discuss this incredible topic of the mask we wear, exploring the realms of the Enneagram, conscious suffering, and so on. I am having a slightly more grave mood opening up the episode today because there are two great souls in our community that have departed, and Jai Jagannath Prabhu will just take a moment to acknowledge that, and we'll give due honor to them.
Yes, His Grace Pankajangri Prabhu, whose fame is spread all over the three worlds, and especially in this world, especially in our movement. One of the original pujaris in Mayapur, Prabhupada said of he and his brother that there is no comparison. They're one of a kind. Also, His Grace Sadharma Prabhu in Vrindavan. I did not know him personally, but I am close to his sons, Ananda Murti and Yogi. And he's also just recently departed. And really, there's no words that one can say at such a sensitive time. Really, I don't have anything inspiring or any particular realizations, but we would like to just give a honor to these great souls in their departure, maybe by a moment of silence. I don't know if that's exactly a Vaishnav activity per se. Usually we have like celebrations or of the sort, because there's a return to the spiritual reality. Also, to leave the world in the holy place is a very auspicious activity. But there's maybe a little bit of a Western approach to just honor the departure with a minute of silence. Maybe we can take the time to offer a personal prayer in our heart for these great souls, or maybe really honestly a prayer of receiving their mercy, because they were extraordinary personalities. So we're going to do that for maybe 1 minute, so just a time to check in and offer prayer, something that we may not actually give ourselves time to do due to the fast moving pace of our lives. So we're just going to do that now. And take just 1 minute here to honor these great souls. Beginning now. I'll put it on the screen so no one gets bewildered. Hare Krishna. I knew I was going to get this comment. Why silence, chant Hare Krishna? I just knew that comment was going to come. That's why I gave my little preamble in the beginning. Anyway, Hare Krishna. Please send your prayers to anyone you may know who's connected to these persons and your well-wishing. And Hare Krishna. Rasanath Prabhu, thank you so much for joining us again for part 2 of this discussion. Last week was very well received. I was getting comments throughout the week appreciating the content of last week's episode. So really happy to have you here again this week.
Thank you for having me again. It's wonderful to be back.
So last week we were exploring just sort of the origins of Enneagram, especially in terms of its being founded as a sort of system in which we categorizing the ways in which we forget God.
Yes.
And then become preoccupied. There's like certain patterns of forgetfulness, which I found that to be a very fascinating topic because, as I mentioned last week, and we discussed it, that forgetfulness of God is understood as the root problem of existence in this world, as far as theistic Vedanta of the Gaudiya is concerned. So it's really fascinating that someone can make a system around that and say, like, hey guys, there's a pattern in which we forget God, and to kind of be aware of that so we can circumvent this problem of forgetfulness and become absorbed in God. So that was a fascinating approach. What we wanted to do this week, based on just a small conversation after the last week's podcast, is kind of talk about how the scheme of Enneagram combined with some of your research with Varnashram, which you had mentioned, can be used to help develop like a healthy ego. I just felt like with Vedantic philosophy in general, and kind of even in sort of new age self-help universe that's very popular today, ego is viewed as the enemy. I think there was a book by, maybe it's Ryan Holiday, called Ego is the Enemy. Only reason I know that is because I remember several devotees sharing this book on their social media pages. Ego is the enemy. Ego is, and I was just like, I don't know if it's like ego is just there. And it seems like on a philosophical level for us, ego isn't necessarily the enemy. It's our identification with the ego that is problematic. So yeah, I kind of wanted to start there. And I was remembering this verse from Bhagavad Gita 18:17, Yasya aham krita bhava, that one should not be in the mood of the ego, or like the sense of identifying with the ego. So I feel like we may like villainize the ego unfairly, where the problem is not so much the ego, but it's our identification with it that is the problem. But if we can not identify with it, but recognize it for what it is and work with it, then we may be able to, develop ourselves in a healthy way, conventionally speaking, which can then help us in our spiritual life. I don't know, some thoughts on that? I kind of want to start there.
I also just briefly wanna expand on that and just bring in this phrase that you could also think about it as like archetypes of self-absorption. And then I also just want to bring in like a really wonderful definition of sin that I heard from Danadar Swami some years ago that really stuck with me, is because it's kind of like a heavy word, and it's something which also has a lot of kind of like maybe distaste attached to it in the Western world. But just like sin can be defined as anything which essentially makes us excessively selfish to the point where we completely disregard the the needs and the interests of others, where we just become excessively self-absorbed. So I think that just like this kind of like framing it in this way is also a helpful thing.
Thank you. Thank you for saying that. I'm sure you both know this. The etymological meaning of the word sin is to miss the mark.
Oh, really?
Yeah, that's the etymological meaning of the word sin, is to miss the mark. And the idea, Soren Kierkegaard, in his book *The Sickness Unto Death*. So for some of us may know Soren Kierkegaard, some of us may not know him all that well, but he is the founding father of existentialism, and again has been a big force of inspiration in my own journey in bhakti, because his language is he speaks about devotion to God. And in his book, he actually talks about the sin as missing the mark, in the sense that anything that is not, if we are not acting on the platform of the soul's identity, we miss the mark. Right?
I miss the mark very regularly then.
Yeah, exactly. So So it's so to understand that is a very it's just very, very helpful. And then there is also a way in which Krishna sees that. So he understands, Krishna understands, God understands our struggle. So the way the word sin is used many times is as a word of judgment.
Right.
But Krishna understands how we are conditioned to miss the mark. But if we are trying to get back,
hopefully,
it's a very different, and then it's a very different experience. In the Bhagavatam, the 11th canto,
Jata Shraddha Katasu.
Yeah, there's a particular verse that exactly that verse. Actually, I repeat this to myself a lot. Yatu Shraddha Mat Katasu Nirvinna Sarvaka Masu Veda Dukhat Makan Kaman Parityage Api Anishwara Tato Bhajeta Mam Prita. That's Krishna's.
That line, Krishna. Very important line.
So Krishna is saying that a sincere soul may still miss the mark because of long-standing conditioning, and we see that in the Bhagavatam too. We see direct examples in the Srimad Bhagavatam of that. Bharat Maharaj, is a very powerful example.
Yeah.
Where the savior syndrome, the protection, the desire to protect. He was a king his entire life, and when he saw the fawn, the goodness of his heart as a king, as a protector, re-emerged. But then also came the conditioning of it. Right. So and then his decision was, well, never again. And then we see Jada Bharat, right? So there's this we are always given the chance, and that's so important to recognize. That's Krishna's mercy. That's Krishna's grace. And this ties to your question, Jai Jagannath Prabhu, about the word ego. And sometimes the categorization of the ego as an enemy, like you can hear Prabhupada talking about Maya as this other thing that we should always be vigilant about. It, Maya is the enemy.
Right.
Lust is the enemy. So there is a way in which that categorization sometimes helps us be vigilant. So there is a purpose behind that categorization, and then the ego can co-opt that for its own purpose.
He's so expert.
So yeah, the ego knows both sides. Like I remember this Bugs Bunny cartoon. How Bugs Bunny is playing tennis, and Bugs Bunny plays tennis on both sides as the opponent. So he runs across the net, hits the ball from the other side, and is also commenting on how each of the players are playing. Right, like that's in general the experience of the ego. The ego can play on both sides, and there is a term for it. It's called the inner critic. The inner critic is the voice of the ego, and the ego can co-opt anything for its own purposes. So when we so there is a purpose to categorizing the ego as the enemy, which is the vigilant, to bring about the vigilant nature to it. And then I guess the more mature way of looking at it, which I think the Vedic perspective was that the ego is a necessary part in our journey towards Krishna. Just like it was a way of forgetting Krishna too, right? But then it's also a way back. It's necessary for us to go back as well. And the example that comes to mind many times for me is when you have to send a payload, a satellite into space. We need a rocket. Now, the rocket is not the essence. But in order to reach escape velocity from the gravitational pull, the rocket is necessary. A well-functioning rocket, I should say, is a necessary.
Right.
Is a necessity, and then at a certain point in time, the rocket has to fall off. Right. So that's how I look at the ego. But when we are too attached to the ego, when the ego becomes the core way of our identification in this world, and the rocket never takes off. It's still rooted. That's the thing. It's still rooted in the, implanted in the, and then it implodes, right? It never takes off. It may give the, sometimes how you see like the boosters, they go off and then it's like, okay, it's going to take off, and then it just like the rocket just like tumbles down.
Okay, so what do we need to do then to get a well-functioning rocket? I think one of the most common questions that comes up, at least it's definitely one that I must have heard it at least 100 times over my short 20 years being around emotional communities. But once people kind of figure out, like, there's a thing called the swabha and there's a thing called the swadharma, and ideally the two should be congruent if you're going to have like a healthy, functioning, conventional life. The most common question that comes up: how do I know what my nature is? This is like, this question, you hear it so many times per year. Like, it comes, especially if you're a teacher, like, because I teach a lot. This is one of the most common questions that comes up. So, and the question in the context of what we were just talking is, how do I build a well-functioning rocket, or how do I discover a well-functioning rocket so that my conventional life can take me up toward, especially in our context, towards spiritual life? So how do you help people to, I guess, identify that? Like, we're interested in your research, I guess, in terms of Varna Ashram and Enneagram, and how you help people discover an answer to that particular question. Thank you.
It's it's still a lot of research going on. Continue to learn every day about this. The important thing to understand here is that the swadharma and deha dharma, and when I say deha dharma, I include the gross and the subtle body. It's subtle, right? And I think when many times we get asked the question, so tell me what my nature is, it starts to simplify. You're basically saying, well, give me a formula,
right?
So that I can figure this out. Now, traditionally, the way it used to happen was in a gurukul. There were no questionnaires that you would answer.
Right.
The reason why questionnaires don't work, and this is something that we very clearly say. Maybe it helps directionally, but it's never. I've never come across a single questionnaire that accurately gives you a clear sense of who you are. Two reasons for it, and I think the Vedic culture really understood that. One is, in order to be able to answer those questions honestly, we need honesty, and we need enough awareness about ourselves.
Right.
To be able to go towards those places. Usually, those questions, the answers to those questions, come from a place of social desirability and circumstances. Which never accurately inform. What we are looking for is a pattern that defies social desirability and circumstances, right? Like, we are looking for a universal pattern that always existed. So it takes a very deep level of awareness, questioning, and understanding, which is why this work was done by the Gurukul. The teachers were trained to identify and understand the nature. It takes a lot of subtlety to be able to do that. They were trained, they were Brahmins by nature, they were Brahmins. And the idea is that the Brahmins have the subtlety to get to what somebody else is not seeing, because they have the nature for it and they're trained for it. Right. The second thing that's important here is, just like in order to look at our face, we can look at all the parts of our body without a mirror, but to look at our face, we need a mirror. In order to look at the deepest parts of our being, which is, our subtle, our real nature, our varna, we need someone to accurately reflect us, just like a mirror would. Again, which is why in Vedic culture we had a system to understand somebody's nature. So, to me, this happens through exploration. It takes conversations with someone who's relatively well trained and understands the subtlety of the system. And in a dialogue, and in a space where we can be honest, then we begin to see certain patterns that are natural in nature really begin to emerge. And that's how I have found, whether it's the Enneagram or the Varnas, or a combination of both of them, this is how I've found to be able to discover people's natures. We do this in our work all the time. And when we can help someone understand, it's there is a struggle before you get there. People have a certain idea of who they want to be.
Yeah, definitely. I'm not gonna lie. I'm really not gonna lie. When here in Bhakti Center, when all the guys were like into Enneagram and explaining things, there was definitely an element of me was like, I don't want to hear that, because I don't know if I'm ready to hear certain things about myself that would like line up. I'm just like, I don't know if I'm ready for that. So no.
Yeah. So that's why when someone asks this question, well, so what is my nature? Many times it's, yes, there is this wanting to know, excitement to know, but also there is a fear of knowing, because it feels like I'm kind of helpless against it. Like, I want to be this, but what if I am this, and what does that mean, and like all the implications that come with that.
But what's coming up for me though is like, if you have a particular nature, right, that you are fundamentally endowed with, at least temporarily pertaining to your conditioning in this lifetime, shouldn't that fundamental endowment inform the desire that comes up into your like conscious awareness about what you want to be? Like, why should there necessarily be for people such a disparity between what they would want to be and what they really are? Like, shouldn't a certain level of peace and contentment arise when you discover your nature, a certain knowing, a certain sense of ease? Should that not manifest?
It's
when you come into contact with it.
It's a great question, and I from my little experience of doing this work, and this work requires a lot of sensitivity because of the social structures and the definitions of success, quote unquote, that we actually live with. There are spoken and unspoken elements of shame associated with certain natures.
Right.
Which brings up a lot of challenges. So that's one part. The other part is also the and we are living in a time where the notion of hierarchy is being really looked at and scrutinized and torn down in so many ways. And yet, in our own emotional world, we have we have a certain hierarchy where when we look at someone famous, we all want to be that.
Right.
And we think that, and then that person may also be telling us, well, I became famous because of who I am. Now, this is I was just discussing it with my wife today morning. The implications of that is, well, if you become who you are, you will become famous. That is incorrect. That is like, these are the associations we make.
Mm.
And these are also the messages that we actually get. Those are I would say, incorrect messages. When we become who we are, first of all, on the level of the physical, psychophysical body, the ego starts to lose its grip on us. Right? It's freeing. There is a way in which I just okay, I don't have to work so hard to prove who I am. There is a way in which now suddenly the mask starts to separate a little bit. Right? And for that to happen, this work has to be done with a lot of sensitivity and care, which I think, in our Kanishta ways of applying this, just like we would with Krishna consciousness sometimes, we tend to put people in a box. Because it reinforces certain things. It also reinforces our own sense of superiority. So this work, that's why this work was traditionally done by people who truly had a Brahmanical nature. It takes sensitivity, it takes real care. It can't be done. It's like, in my own study of astrology, also, one of the things that you do understand the sense of responsibility as an astrologer is when you are really talking about somebody's life, and you are, through that process, trying to have influence or be an expert, you incur severe reactions for those. So we don't take this work lightly. We take this work with a lot of gravity and seriousness, and it's not a game for us. And neither should it be a game for anyone. It has very serious consequences and implications in somebody's life. And when we want somebody to be healthy, then we do it with care, and we also provide guidance in terms of how do you process all of this and where do you start.
I have so many questions that's coming up for me. Sorry, I don't know if you wanted to say more, but just a quick sidebar, somewhat of a sidebar in terms of where we were just going. How do you deal with the sociological pressure of a very external metric of success? Like, I'm sure there are other sociological factors that complicates self-discovery in a conventional way. But this one seems like a really major one. And the reason it's really sticking out to me is because I've had several conversations just this last week. And one of the questions I was asking to some of my friends who are working hard to achieve a certain metric of success, which I understand to be quite external. One of the questions I was asking several of my friends this week was, what's wrong with being poor? Like, if you find meaningful work, and when I say poor, I don't mean like abject poverty, but I mean like you find work that you feel, gives value, you feel fulfilled by doing that work, and you're able to take care of your basic necessities and those around you. And that's kind of it. You're not going to be living a life of luxury and leisure and so on. What's wrong with that? Like, what's the problem? And just talking to some of my friends, there's a huge pressure of being successful, where success is defined in terms of the external accoutrements, whether it's wealth, its position, its followers, and so on. So if you have to give guidance, you're dealing with this very powerful sociological condition. And how do you help people get over get over the fence or get over that threshold, which just seems like a really tough one.
It is a tough one, which is why when you play the role of a mentor or counselor or coach, it takes a lot of patience, because you have to work with where someone is at. And this also goes back to what we were discussing about a healthy ego structure, right?
Right.
When the ego structure is still flimsy, and the thing is, the ego by nature is fragile. It can't. And we see the fragility of the ego. We are experiencing it on so many different levels. The agenda of the soul is too much for the ego to bear, because it can't.
Whoa.
It can't. It really can't. So then it has to prove itself in some way. And so all of these different things are ways for the ego to prove its own might. Right? The best way I can say. So sometimes what's important is to let people get there and see if that does still satisfy. And based on my experience and what I see in the world of, both in my banking world and in the world that I work in now, which, I work with people who have, done a lot in their life. And there is emptiness. There is still emptiness. And so now there is no place to go, really. Now, what we do is we accompany them on this journey. Even when they want to get some success, we accompany them on the journey. Only with the sense that along the way they don't fixate so hard that when the time comes that they have to step back and look at it, that they are able to do it. And I see this being directly parallel to, what the super soul is doing with us, really. Like, Krishna accompanies us on this journey, and he's waiting for us to turn back to him. And I remember very clearly what my guru told me once about preaching. And I use this word very deliberately. There's a lot of sensitivity. But I think this redefined for me what preaching was. And he said that we have to look at a living entity not from a point of view of one lifetime, but several lifetimes. So that's the vision of a preacher. And so it just completely okay. How soon can I get you to start chanting 16 rounds? Well, who does it really so? Well, I get an extra medal on my own, like I get a feather in my own hat, right? It's almost like trophies that we collect when we truly care for someone's actual journey towards Krishna. It's a very sensitive thing. And sometimes we have to look at, well, where is this person? And how can I accompany this person in this journey in a way that, I'm always waiting for the deeper questions to emerge. But then also giving the space for whatever this soul needs to experience in this life so that those deeper questions can emerge. It's such a subtle balance.
Okay, coming back to this helping people discover their conventional I part. Now, when I joined Krishna consciousness, it's like Varnashram, it's like this, very simple template. This is a social body. This is the head. These are the arms. These are the legs. And as you hang around a little bit, you're like, it ain't that simple. And I imagine that, you have like these 9 archetypes in the Enneagram. And I guess the question that's coming up for me is that, are these, when you're helping people to come to the discovery of this conventional I, is there sometimes a sense that you're just like using an archetype like provisionally, like for the time being, as you discover something that fits, or like how does that exactly play itself out or work itself out? And I think also with, at least in what the Vedic culture that we hear about, it was a lot easier because couples came together very prudently. Like it wasn't just about love. It was like, we have this mentality. We're trying to produce this type of child, and we're going to ensure that they exist in this type of community so that those particular qualities will emerge in the most strong and healthy way that's useful for the social body. When you look at our society today, we hear about Varna, Sankara, and Nigita, and fast forward to 21st century, I often bring this point up. We are products of Sankara. Like, we're not even like a mixture of Varnas. We're like a mixture of a mixture of a mixture of a mixture, which makes sense to me why, like, the younger generations, I'm a millennial, and after, just is like a lot of confusion. And so how is something like Varna or Ashram or Enneagram or whatever is supposed to help such a confused generation of people, internally confused, figure out what they are? Like, how does that work out exactly? And your experience with this work, yeah.
The first thing I must say is that is why Kalo nasteva 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 gatiranyata. Hare Rama eva kevalam. The idea of the holy name being all in all, and Mahaprabhu's mercy that just basically surpasses all of this. I think the dependence on that is the biggest. Now, to me, a part of our own spiritual evolution may be gradually discovering our nature, meaning our conventional, as you said, our conventional I. But it's not a necessity for going back to Godhead. It's not. We know that very clearly. And in Kali Yuga, the rules are even more like super relaxed. It's the challenge. The reason why I think it's important to discuss these topics is that given that we are a part of a social structure, talk about ISKCON as an institution or the broader social structure, we live in a world. I think our behaviors, our attitudes, our nature, and our sense of identity all has an implication both in ourselves and other people. That can interfere with our surrender to Krishna. Which is why it becomes important to understand that. So now, when we come to Kali Yuga specifically, it's very complex. Now, even with the complexity, the water still has a very basic property, and it shows up. It may be mixed, it may have a different color, but it still has a basic property. This is the law of nature. You can't, and that's why it's called Dharma. It's called Varnashram Dharma. It's because when you do hit that part, even if there is Varna Sankara, there is still a dominant way in which it shows up that cannot be hidden, right? And that has to be very, again, it takes subtlety to get to that place, and it's there. And while it may be tainted with other aspects, it's still there, and it's showing up. Right? We can't. It's not. It's. It takes for us to really observe ourselves to be able to locate it. And it does emerge. And then once it emerges, you're like, how did I miss that? It's like, oh, it lived for so long. How did I miss that? But it takes repeated observation to be able to see. And so the nature shows up, undeniably shows up.
How far, Prabhu, can someone get by themselves? Like, I'm just thinking, what you're doing is obviously very specialized, and you do it with so much care and so much attention and so much sensitivity. But how can it be made like more widely accessible?
How do you
Because not everyone will have access to you or your team, or like how people are so afflicted, and it like
Prabhupada's stress on why we need brahmanas is so, it's not, he didn't just casually make that statement. It was not to minimize pujari work. It was not just for like, we need brahmanas because then who would take care? Who would take care of the deities in the temple. The idea of brahmanical work is really cultivating people. And the challenge with brahmanical work is it can't be scaled. It's like, okay, now that I've created a prototype, you need more Brahmins. Because you're doing very subtle, this is subtle work. Right? So you need what we are trying to do, unfortunately. So this is what happens, and this is not a value judgment. This is just understanding how one energy works with another energy. When you have a Vaishya who's looking at the Brahmanical work, and so Vaishyas naturally think about how to scale. That's the first place to go. How do I scale? It's also like when you really look at what is essential versus what is marginal. A lot of people say, "Oh, you're a scholar, therefore you must be a Brahmin." Not true. Not true. Not true. A Brahmin's essence is very different. Like you can have Vaishyas who are scholars too. You can have Kshatriyas who are scholars.
Right.
A Brahmin has a certain capacity for, you can't substitute it. Like, for example, patience, forgiveness. In order to teach someone, you need these very essential things. Both, you see the Mahabharata. Bhishma and Drona both learned under Parashuram. Now, Bhishma could have actually said, you know what, since I learned from the same teacher, I can teach. It takes, a Kshatriya loses patience. Like, do it this way. Brahmin has to bring a lot of patience. And you have to have the supply of patience in order to teach and train someone. Right? So you can't really substitute the role. You can't. So when you try to scale things, what you start losing is the subtlety, which is what has happened to a lot. Now there is another excuse that comes into play, and there's a place for this too. Well, let's try to get at least 50% of the effect of this work to 200,000 more people, right? Okay, there's some truth to that. There's definitely some truth to that. But then what we have to be very careful about is, what are we willing to compromise? And is that it has to be a very intentional compromise, not a compromise, right? Now, many times in scaling, we make unintentional compromises, which then there's the effect of what it's truly meant to be provided, what is truly meant to be created doesn't happen. So that's why this work is very. What we want to do is we want to be able to train more people, and we want to get further trained. I mean, this is what we really want to do. And through that, then over time, increase the nature of increase the work. I think that within the institution of ISKCON, it'll be very, very helpful to have an entire body that exclusively starts to focus on, well, how do we understand somebody's nature accordingly? I think that'll make a very big difference.
It seems like that would be really powerful in the context of like a proper Gurukula also. Because I do feel like, at least in our ISKCON family, we've kind of thrown the baby out with the bathwater a little bit because we've had struggles with Gurukulas in the past. So it's just like, all right.
But also, if you see how I've heard this from people during that time, that if you can't collect money, if you can't distribute books, if you can do work in the temple, then you become a Gurukula teacher. It was something that was given, it was not given priority. That's not how Prabhupada desired. For the Gurukula, I mean, it's quite the opposite. It's very specialized.
Right.
Right. And so we need specialists who can actually specifically do this kind of work. That's where we will begin to see the effects of it.
What I appreciate about the way you're answering these questions is that it's not like, yeah, here are the 9 and here are the 4, and like, you could just figure it out. In other words, no one's going to be able to like hear this and like, okay, I have this free podcast. I'm going to be able to figure this all out. I like that the answer is like, well, there's conversation, there's exploration, there's dialogue that has to happen. It's a lot of work. It's patience. So it makes it, in other words, we're not just satisfying that query. What's my nature? What is simple? Here's the archetype. Just figure out which one fits you the most. And then you've discovered it. It's like, nope, it's pretty much hard work. And you're going to need someone with you to kind of help reflect yourself to yourself so that you can discover. I really appreciate that sort of answer. I'm curious. Yeah.
One more along those lines. The reason why that's important is because your muscles of self-awareness start to build when you enter into that kind of a dialogue. This is not a cookie cutter formula. I give it to you and you have like this is fast food spirituality, right? Like, okay, just give it, like put it in the microwave, give it to me, and that's not how the Vedas were designed. That's also, I think, real spiritual traditions. They basically say, well, are you willing to walk? This is a discovery. Are you willing to come with me on this journey? So in the process of stepping into the journey, that itself starts to build the muscles for deeper self-awareness. So we can't shortchange the process. It's tragic when we shortchange the process. And so this is the thing, 2 people may arrive at the same answer, one through a quiz, the other one through a dialogue, but they will arrive at the same answer very differently. Very differently. And that is important. Most important, I'd say.
I have 2 more questions on my little list here. And one of them pertains to differences that you've observed doing this work with men versus doing it with women. And I know it's a very unpopular idea these days that men and women are different. Somehow it's become increasingly unpopular notion, especially in the context of like this sort of gender politics and identity politics and so on. But I mean, I basically understand that men and women have very kind of fundamentally different natures in certain departments. And so when doing this work with men versus women, have you noticed distinctions? I'm curious, and I'm obviously curious in terms of its impact on men in the context of this podcast and our personal interests. But have you noticed some distinctions there between how, I guess, men take to the process versus how women do it? Or, yeah, I'm just kind of curious about that.
Thank you for asking. Karuna, did you have anything to add to this? I felt you might have had some.
Definitely, I certainly do. But let's first hear your answer. Then we'll get into it.
Okay. So for us, our experience has been that women can walk into the space of vulnerability a lot more easily. And it's something that even with what you said about men and women are equal, I think one of the biggest reasons why that fight for equality has reached such a stage, and I wouldn't even use the word equality. I think it feels like, well, men are here and women have to like come here. That's not how I look at it at all.
Right.
I just look at it as like, human, and within this species of human, there's just so many variations of the psychophysical nature. And they are different, and it's so important to acknowledge the difference, because otherwise we would create a very troublesome machine.
Right.
And then it's also important to acknowledge the similarities and the differences. So it's important to do that. But what we have found in our work is that women are very much more open to vulnerability and opening and being honest and being able to share more of what they're struggling with. Now, what I must also say is that doesn't necessarily mean that it lasts. Right? And what I've also found is when we can get to that place with men, it can go a lot deeper than we have been with women. So while I say the start can be easier with women and much more difficult with men, what I have in my own experience is that once the movement is made, once the walls are broken, it's also possible to actually go faster and deeper. But that's just experience. So, and again, I must say that it all completely depends on the health of the person. So this is, while these are general observations, these are not necessarily universal. There are exceptions to this. We have seen many exceptions to this on both sides. So these are just general observations and experiences that we have had. Yeah.
Nice. I don't know if you want to ask something, Karuna Avatar. It looks like you're about to. All right, go.
But do you have something that's pressing?
It's not pressing. It's my last question containing one important element that Rasanath, you had mentioned in your email that I wanted to get to, but maybe your question is opportunate to what's discussed right now, so you can go first, and then I'll add.
Prabhu, how do you make what?
It's just very dramatic pause and pensive, and anyway, don't mind me.
How do you see, I imagine that in working with people, you have, it must be from your subjective experience, a profoundly meaningful experience, something that you do. You must see person after person going through really substantial transformation, right? From your point of view. But yet your scope of working with people is limited. Your circle of influence has a certain cap. But yet everyone needs this. So like because I have this like really unfortunate, I don't know if it's that unfortunate, but I kind of have this like this conditioning that I have a desire to just like help everyone and save everyone and like extract everyone from their plight, you know? Yeah, it's like it's absurd. So my question to you is, what is your wisdom around making peace with the limitations of your circle of influence? And like, are you at peace with like, okay, you're only gonna be, you know what I mean?
I'm never at peace. I think a big part of this work, and we are learning to really embrace that more and more, is we have signed up for a life of living attention for our entire life.
What do you mean by living attention?
The attention, attention, and attention is it's now we talk about balance a lot, right? These days, everybody's talking about balance and what does balance mean, and how do we get balanced in our life, right? What I'm essentially saying is, how can I just experience the things that I want to experience without experience the things that I don't want to experience? Balance is you need opposing forces for balancing. Just like you see a structure standing, and you see, there are beams on two sides. There is opposing forces. This is also why we need liberals and conservatives. They're opposing forces. The idea is they have to work closer to the line of balance than polarized. What we have today is very entrenched polarization, unfortunately. But these are energies. And when I say living the tension, the idea is, well, how do I live the tension of real good, thorough work? And at the same time, think about, well, how can this work reach a lot of people? Right? That is attention. And I can say for Hari Prasad, our entire team, it's like we scratch our heads on a daily basis. Okay, how do we solve this problem? It's a burden that we carry, and we haven't yet come across a formula that we have found. Now, what has definitely happened though is that somehow we have scaled. But that's not been our plan in some ways. All that we are doing is taxing our heads, taxing our brains to see how can we do this. And this is where I think Krishna is the scaler. Krishna is the, it's like he's the amplifier here of everything. And so what we are trying to do, and this is not an excuse, while we continue to tax our brains to see how we can scale this, and if you have any ideas at all, we would be, I mean, we would
send them a message on outbuild.com. He's open to
very happy to discuss it too, because we are in need of help. We haven't figured this out. And at the same time, our hope is that by learning how to sincerely serve and very genuinely try to be instruments. And when I say this, I'm really trying to see if I'm saying this for the sake of more validation from the outside world, or if I truly mean it. To really be very deeply able to connect to Krishna's heart and the heart of the Parampara. Our hope is that somehow Krishna will send the resources to scale it. And that's our prayer. That's our desire. But
nice.
On a day-to-day basis, we still continue to say, okay, how do we scale this? We have to do our part.
I actually don't know how much time you have for today's episode.
I have some more time. I have.
Yeah, some more. Okay, because we didn't check in for that part. In the email that you sent me, there was this other piece about understanding Varna Ashram Enneagram in order for us to, and you use this language, conscious suffering, which was, and then you called it liminal, the liminal space.
Liminal space. Sachinandana Swami has been speaking about the liminal space.
The liminal space. Okay. Now, this word liminal means threshold, right?
Yeah, it's the threshold. It's the in-between space.
The in-between space. Okay. This language, conscious suffering. I really appreciate it because it just made. I've been suffering for the last week since our last podcast. I had an allergy that turned into a very severe body ache for a few days, and I was suffering like anything. And all I wanted to be was unconscious. Like that was like my highest aspiration in life. And so feeling that for a week and then seeing your mail and it was like conscious suffering, I was just brought to that experience. And then I started being brought to the experience of like suffering in general and the ways in which I or humanity in general, we try to make ourselves unconscious of it by alcohol, drugs, pornography. I mean, there are so many things that one may take shelter of to become unconscious.
Yep.
So you were talking about Varna Ashram Enneagram as a means of entering the liminal space and really becoming purified. And I was kind of fascinated by that point. And that's the last of what I got here from my side.
Okay. I got more.
Okay. Just to step back and think about, we have been discussing in the language of James Hollis and Father Richard Rohr, the two halves of life, the first half and the second half. The first half being where we make the ego structure healthy so that when the second half arrives, the ego learns how to let go. And my understanding is that the Srimad Bhagavatam is the second half of life literature.
Mm-hmm. Definitely.
The idea of dharma projita kaitavo is, it's the dharma of the soul.
Mm-hmm.
That's what the Bhagavatam is really. And now, interestingly, when you enter the Bhagavatam, also, you see the war is over, right? And the Pandavas themselves are entering into, like all of them. You see, there's this leaving the space to get into the second half. Parikshit. Right, you see this theme in the Bhagavatam, Vidura in the third canto.
Right.
It's the time of the old dying and the new coming to the fore. Vyasadeva himself, right? Vyasadeva himself is experiencing that. He's done all the work. Sorry.
What's the first word of Vedanta Sutra again?
Therefore.
Therefore, or like, could you say like now? Like now that the first half of life is behind us.
Yes.
Yeah?
Yes. And so
let us proceed.
Let's proceed, right? It's so to get to that place, we have to what we call walk through the liminal. And the liminal is like, the liminal space is almost like I have left the land behind. I know this is not going to serve me anymore. But then I have not landed on the other side. Right? I'm just in this in between like space where it's like I know my egoic way of being is no longer serving my purpose. I'm experiencing an emptiness, right? This is where, when you see Sanatana Goswami coming to Mahaprabhu, it's like, who am I really? Like, right? It is very existential. You see the same thing with Arjuna. In his performance of Dharma, he's confronted to enter into the liminal space. Everything I know as a Kshatriya is falling apart.
Right.
Right. So that's the falling part. Right. When the liminal space is where we are in a free fall. We have not landed on this. right? And that is the space that I call conscious suffering. And the reason why, and even before that, it begins even before that, where when I truly understand my nature, I can engage it, but I also see how my nature keeps me a prisoner. That it brings about a certain kind of suffering. And that's why it's so important that Krishna in the Gita, he says very clearly, in the performance of your duty, whatever suffering, tolerate the suffering that comes in the path of performing your duty, because inevitably it is going to happen. The reason why I can tolerate it is because it is my nature. When I'm doing something that's not in my nature, and when the suffering comes, it's like I collapse.
Right.
Unbearable.
Unbearable. You can't hold it. It's just not possible. Right. So when I know my nature and I encounter the suffering, it becomes conscious suffering. I know it. I know this is going to come. I know I cannot react to it. I can't blame other people. This is something that I have to face. Then, when you talk about tolerance, it makes a lot of sense. When you're asking someone who's doing something that's not their nature and you tell them to tolerate it, it's violence.
Sure, man.
It is violence. So it becomes very important. Can I ask someone to tolerate this just on a psychophysical way? And when Krishna is telling that to Arjuna, in the course of performing your duty, you have to tolerate. This is Kshatriya Dharma. This is your duty, Arjuna. And this, you have to fight this war. It's painful. So if we are not able to cultivate that, then tolerance becomes a myth, really. Like I'll try it for some time, and then I'll say this doesn't work. I throw out the whole principle.
Right.
You know what's amazing? Bhaktivinoda Thakur, if you read Bhakti Aloka,
Love that book.
It's one of my favorite books. When he is actually translating Rupa Goswami's principles, he actually says it applies differently for different ashramas. It applies differently for different varnas. The reason for that is there is a certain threshold here. Right. So when we understand our nature, when we also understand in the performance of our dharma, what are the kind of sufferings that we will have to encounter, then we step into it willingly. Then that becomes conscious suffering.
Proactive suffering.
And then that's when right after matra sparshasta kaunteya shitoshna sukha agama apayino anityastam titikshasva bharata, that titiksha then becomes, when one can do that kind of tolerance, then one becomes, as Krishna says in the next verse, eligible for liberation.
Right.
Because what happens is the ego cracks. Right? Even when I'm a Brahmin or a Kshatriya, the suffering comes. And I understand that even with all the capacities and my nature, I can't. Like there is deeper surrender. Otherwise, what I do is I react. And that creates what last time we discussed, unnecessary suffering.
Yeah.
So many people.
I feel a little I don't know what the word is, like almost like desperate. Just like hearing this and seeing the value of what it is that you're sharing, but also understanding that so many of us practitioners, and what to speak of ordinary humanity, not going to like a lot of these points hinges on like a self-awareness of the conventional self, also what to speak of the spiritual self, like a healthy self-awareness of the conventional self, which a lot of us may not yet have. And so all this wisdom that you're sharing is hinging on that like basic self-awareness that we don't have. And it produced a feeling of just like, dude, I'm screwed. And where is like the hope?
Jai,
Yeah.
do you personally feel screwed, or are you generalizing that for most people?
I think I'm generalizing it. I have to say, on a personal level, I mean, I obviously have a lot of work that needs to go on personally, but I think I have had a lot of conversations and exploration that I was able to come to a discovery of sort of the work that I'm supposed to be doing in this life. It's work that I'm satisfied with. Somehow or other, in a very weird way, I'm maintained by it. But I'm not rich, I'm poor, and I'm satisfied with that also. It doesn't bother me whatsoever. And so I feel a little bit of, and I have a little bit of self-awareness. I don't think I have the depth of self-awareness that I could be having for me to respond with tolerance to certain suffering and so on. So I kind of see the importance of this. So I don't think I'm just generalizing for others. I do feel it a little bit myself also. And I guess I'm looking for the point of just like, I guess like a hope. Someone like me who's expressing this, what do you say to give them hope when they're not yet having the level of self-awareness they need to like consciously suffer and really purify and enter into this liminal space and so on?
I'm gonna extend what Jai just said, like, and that's basically my last question, but it's like a perfect addition. I feel like what I feel a very beautiful crystallization of Achintya Beta Beta Tattva has just kind of like manifested for me, and I would like to share that. I feel like, okay, Rasanath Prabhu, you're doing work with individuals and you're seeing that what you're doing with them is so, like, every person is so individual. Every person is truly unique, and like the work that you do is so nuanced according to those unique traits, right? But at the same time, what is most personal is also most universal, as Damodar Prasad Prabhu said a few episodes back when he joined us here. I love the way that he said that. And then my dear friend Kelly Kanana also had a line in this little spoken word poetry piece that him and I did together a while back, where he said, "What's true for me is true for you reliably." Right?
Yep.
So like, if we had to, in terms of Achintya Beta Beta, if we had to like hone in on the oneness aspect, the universality aspect, like from your vantage point, also just in relation to Jai's identification of the widespread malaise and lack of self-awareness, what would your advice be? Your universal advice?
We all have the capacity for self-awareness, and it's not such an elusive thing, really. To me, self-awareness begins with the question, well, actually, I'm suffering. Right? And I think going back to your honest, the theme around honesty, there is this element of being able to just acknowledge, you know what, I am suffering. And
I acknowledge that on the regular.
And as soon as we acknowledge that, there is a way in which we can step. Many times we either wallow in it, or we We just want to escape it. We want to hit the eject button, right? And to me, that shortchanges the process of self-awareness. And the capacity for self-awareness, but also the starting point is also universally available. Suffering is universal. It's meant to bring us to a place where we ask the questions, okay, why am I am in Krishna consciousness, I'm practicing Krishna consciousness, why am I suffering? I shouldn't be suffering. And to me, that's the whole that's the part where you say, okay, there are still things that are interfering. There is this, my ego is still showing up. I have to find a way to understand what this is. I have to learn how to work with it, right? And to me, that's where it begins. And as soon as we start doing it, you experience relief. It's not the reason for that is because humility begins. Then we acknowledge our suffering, right? Humility is a self-protecting quality. It is when you have humility, you experience a release. You truly experience a relief from suffering, right? And that begins by acknowledgement. And saying, you know what, I am suffering. I'm chanting my 16 rounds, but Durdaivam, Idrusham, Yanchani, Na Anuragaha. I can't experience it. I'm being tormented by my own egoic, I don't like what that devotee is wearing. I don't like how that devotee speaks. I'm so hurt by how that devotee doesn't acknowledge my value. I am still hurting by what that devotee said 8 years ago. In that, I'm saying this because I experienced it. This is not. And you say, wow, I'm still. It's showing up. Where is it showing up? It's showing up in my japa, right? And I'm still trying to solve for all of that using my abilities. And I realize, okay, you know what? I'm suffering. I'm caught up in my patterns here. And that's when, as soon as we do that, our suffering becomes conscious. You see, as soon as we bring awareness to it, suffering becomes conscious. We learn how to step into it. We learn how to take responsibility. We learn how to ask the questions and seek help. And Krishna's mercy flows through that, really.
Sure.
So may you all suffer so that you will ask the next questions, so that you can make the advancement you need to make on a personal level. Yay.
This brings us back to the full circle, right? Then we started with the whole idea of sin.
Right.
Bhayam dvitiya biniveshitasya tishadupetasya viparyayosmati. As soon as we turn our face away, as soon as we miss the mark, we suffer. It's there. It's just that the reason why we are having to put all of these small pieces in place, like Varnashrama, like the Enneagram, is we can only find our way back slowly. It's retracing. It helps us retrace our path, right? That's why I kept saying the ego that keeps us encapsulated can also become the way out. Systematically can become the way out because it helps us retrace our path back.
There's no such thing as a quantum leap back to Godhead.
It can, which is also why you can never discount Lord Nityananda's mercy.
Oh, Johnny Tai.
That's also the challenge, right? Like, oh my God, I did all of this self-awareness work, and look at that person didn't do shit. Didn't do anything. Still gets the it should be hope giving, right?
Right.
Because Lord Nityananda's mercy can shortchange. So again, what's important for us is to recognize that we don't make the self-awareness work as another ego bolstering thing. That like, yeah, look, I am self-aware. You haven't done the work. That gives me some sense of moral superiority of sorts. Like it's so weird, right? But then that closes the door for the Lord's mercy to, I will become a big self-awareness guru and get the attention of a lot of devotees, perhaps even people outside, but I'll never get Krishna's mercy. So this is all for us to really come from a place of deeper humility. And if awareness doesn't create humility, if it creates superiority, then it's a problem. So that's that's all I can say.
Thank you so much for spending this time with us.
We just have to acknowledge Balaramji's question.
Okay.
We would like to, not we have to. A question came up for me with regards to what you said about the ego needing validation to survive. Could you describe what the opposite of that looks like in terms of healthy heart-to-heart connection and appreciation? Essentially just like expressing that we all need to be shown affection, we all need to be appreciated, we all need to be feel like we're respected on a basic level. Like,
yes. Thank you, Balaram Prabhu, for the question. I think it's a very important question. In Krishna consciousness, we learn that the giver's role, I would say the rules that apply to the giver and the rules that apply to the receiver are very different. By that, what I mean is when we are giving appreciation, we don't give appreciation saying, oh, your ego needs it, and so I'm going to give it to you. You know, oh, you poor thing. Right? When we give appreciation from a place of, this is a living entity that is really dear to Krishna. And so everybody, in that sense of the term, is truly appreciable. But then when you see someone is doing something very specific, that appreciation also becomes very like, hey, you know, you're doing this for Krishna. That's actually, so universally because I'm connected to Krishna. And then in the realm of whatever it is that someone is doing, then it's important to appreciate that. For their being, for their doing, who they are, really. You know? So that's one element of the giver. From the receiver's perspective, it's a very different thing. From the receiver's perspective, the receiver actually understands that I do need the security of being seen. We all have to, like, we all want to be seen. Right? And ultimately, that's Saraswati Thakur's definition of darshan. Is you're standing in front of the deity so that you are seen.
Yay!
It's a very different. I'm going to see the deities, right? It's true. That is also an aspect, but it's to be seen, right? And that's a universal need. We all need to be seen. And on the level of the ego, it becomes a very important way in which the ego becomes healthy. Is when the ego is seen for what it is, accurately seen for what it is, and nourished in that way, then one begins to get a healthy ego. So from a place of the receiver, you understand that when someone is appreciating, this is necessary for my own sense of identity. That many times we say, oh, Prabhu, thank you for the encouragement. Right? What is that? What does that mean? That actually means, well, I need this for my own health. So you see how the giver and the receiver are both humble. It's amazing how, like, when we learn how to receive a compliment and are taught the art of receiving a compliment, it can be so powerful because it instead of it, and this is so important, when food goes into the, when you eat food and instead of going into the food pipe, it goes into your lungs. You start coughing. That is what that's how a receiver has to understand appreciation. I have to be careful to put it through the food pipe. When it goes into the lungs, when it becomes a source of my own prestige, then it becomes trouble. So in that sense of the term, when the receiver knows how to receive it properly, then it helps the ego to become healthy, which is what we see in Kardama Muni's episode. This is a very powerful episode. He prays to Vishnu, and ultimately what he asks from Vishnu is a wife. Right? Honest man, like.
Damn, Kardama, OG honest man.
Years of penance, years of tapasya. And then what he says is what brings tears to Vishnu's eyes is his honesty. Not his bravado, like his whole thing is I am still caught up in Deha Dharma.
Yeah.
So I'm finding the best way to fulfill my Deha Dharma. But there is an element of I'm still ashamed of this. Right? And that honesty brings tears to Vishnu's eyes. Right? So from a receiver's point of view, it's so important for us to be honest. Thank you for your encouragement. I need that, because otherwise I will search for it in very unhealthy ways.
Right.
And one way in which we get attention, honestly, this is it's a very twisted way to get attention, right? Is, when we criticize someone, we get attention. It's an undeniable way of getting attention, because the other person can't just walk away.
Oh my God.
So we see so many toxic ways of the same need for validation, but the pursuit of it is just so unhealthy. I hope, Balaramji, that answers your question. I'm happy to talk more.
Thank you so much for joining us again, Rasanath. For those of you who don't already know, you can definitely check out the work that he's doing on upbuild.com. Is that upbuild.com, right?
Yeah.
I have the website open right here. And maybe you need someone like this to help you get that self-awareness and or clarify it. And may you all, I think, been addicted by you to all suffer, because that really helps the process. So thank you again for this. It's been very lovely these last 2 weeks to have this conversation with you. And
Prabhu, it's been such a joy meeting you and just hearing from you.
Thank you. Thank you for. I feel seen. That's the best way I can actually say this. I go through my own suffering around not being seen for the work that I'm trying to do, and this is giving some validation to my ego, really. And my hope is that that Krishna is also satisfied in the process. That it's not just my ego.
Beautiful.
Thank you so much for this platform and for your questions and for your spirit.
Joy ho.
If you want to get in touch with us, dear listener, ariseheroicman@gmail.com, @ariseheroicman on Instagram. Rasanath Prabhu can be found on Instagram @upbuildnyc. Myself and Jai are also there, of course. And
We
any other house?
We also have a Facebook.
Oh, we have a
Arise.
Facebook now. Yeah.
Arise, the Honest Man's podcast, where we'll be posting all of our podcasts after the show on there, and our newsletter comes up on there, I think, and a few other things. So definitely give us a follow in there, as well as get a follow of Boudica, this amazing devotional community platform. Give a follow on that as well. And thank you all so much for being with us here week in, week out. Next week, we have a really nifty episode with Mahatma Prabhu and his wife on the topic of divorce. So it should be a really hot one.
Mm-hmm.
And I already got my questions prepared. I got some really good ones.
Yay.
So join us for that. And see you all very soon.
Yes.
Hari Hari. Rasanath Prabhu, just remain with us for a second. Thank you.